Good day, my friends. July 2nd, the day after Canada Day, which is July 1st, or Dominion Day, as us Canadian traditionalists might call it. Also, day after the Feast of the Most Precious Blood. And then also, of course, the consecrations of bishops by the SSPX, which I'm sure you know happened. And now, today, there have been released letters from Cardinal Fernandez explaining the penalties. Now, the situation is interesting. It's kind of like during COVID, where you get flooded with all this scary stuff, and it's all very intimidating. My job here is to try to do my best to actually explain what the letters mean, because there's a bunch of footnotes and things like that in these letters, or citations, I should say, and those things are actually vital to actually understanding it. So whatever your opinion on the SSPX may be, you need to understand it properly, because here's the thing. Schism is a sin. In order to be guilty of a sin, you actually have to do the sin. So if you're going to be accusing people of being in a state of sin, you really got to get that right if you should be accusing them of that at all. We must deal with the objective, but we can't make any claims about the subjective. And we're going to go through what that means as we read these letters. Also, I have decided that I will not be watching any podcasts or reading any articles in this present moment from people crying schism and so forth, for a couple reasons. Number one, some of these individuals are my friends, and I mean that. And I don't want to resent my friends, and I'm an imperfect person. I'm Italian through my mother, so I am prone to anger. It's like being, my friend Joey Boca, shout out Joey, he put a tweet out the other day. He's an Irish New Yorker, and he tweeted something like, I don't wish Irish blood on my worst enemy, because it means every morning you get up and by 8 a.m. you found something to be upset about. We have these temperaments from our ancestry, I guess you could say. And as an Italian, I am as prone to anger as I am to romance and to gastronomy. So I know that about myself. And also, one of my great heroes is Michael Davies and Chesterton, two of my heroes. Michael Davies was a huge defender of Archbishop Lefebvre, and then he begged Archbishop Lefebvre to not go through with the consecrations. And then after the consecrations, for a period of 2 or 3 years, something like that, maybe 4 years or whatever it was, he was of the opinion that the SSPX had committed a schismatic act and that Archbishop Lefebvre should not have done it. And it was very tragic for Michael Davies. He was very sad about it because he was a very good man. And then he changed his mind. There's an anecdotal story, so take it for what it's worth. But if you've ever been to St. Mary's, Kansas, obviously the site of St. Pius X is there, but there's a fraternity of St. Peter Parish, close by. Typical Midwestern Kansas fashion. There's, small towns all linked by 10 to 15 minutes of highway, And so one of the local places nearby St. Mary's, there's a fraternity parish. And Michael Davies was, I believe I'm getting this right, he was giving a talk at the fraternity parish near St. Mary's, Kansas, and this was in the 90s. And he was asked by the audience, and I was talking to someone who was relaying this story to me. He was asked by a member in the audience, what do you think of Archbishop Lefebvre? And Michael Davies went on and on about how he thought he was a saint in his books. I don't know if the fraternity parish priest was very happy about that, but Davies ended up changing his mind. And because he was a man of true Christian charity, he remained close and in friendship with those with whom he disagreed. Because ultimately we have to remember that there are many things out of our control, and it is not our job to lose hope or to get emotional or do something drastic because of actions from a very incoherent, illogical, and very much inept hierarchical class of prelates in the church. If you believe there is a crisis in the church, which I don't know how. I don't know how any man who can walk and chew gum and who can read cannot see the obvious state of necessity in the church, which we'll go over later. This podcast is going to be relatively long, by the way. But anyway, if you believe there's a crisis in the church, well, when it comes to these canonical things, we're talking about acts of jurisprudence. We're not talking about definitions of law or definitions of dogma, etc. We're talking about acts of jurisprudence. And legislators can make mistakes. The legislators of the church are not endowed with some sort of infallibility, or some grace that makes them perfect in their legislation. If that were the case, we wouldn't have to have courts. Someone could just pronounce it and that'd be enough. Obviously, you have to have processes. There are also a number of canonical questions that will arise from this because, technically speaking, if somebody is named in an excommunication, which has happened for the 6 bishops involved, interestingly, Dom Pagliarani was not named, but there is supposed to be a right of appeal and a right of defense, which is the church's law, and that is owed de facto and necessarily so to everyone named. So we'll see if they even get a day in court. We'll see. And so there's a lot that's still going to be unearthed about this, and there's a lot of things that are just beyond our control. So we just have to do our best to stick to the facts and then make decisions about those. But effectively, what has happened today is essentially exactly the same thing, and I'll show you why, as what happened in 1988. And the documents attest to that, and we will go through those to explain as such. So, let's bring up the first document, which is the Decree of Excommunication released by Cardinal Fernandez. So I'm going to read it to you. When you do these podcasts on your own and you're doing all of the finagling with the buttons and stuff, sometimes it's hard for me to get everything on the screen because I have other things I got to show. So I'm just going to read you the decree, but then I have other things that I'll show you. So here is what Cardinal Fernandez wrote. He's a prefect for the Dicastery of Bishops. What's interesting... I'll leave this for later. Anyway, okay, so here is the decree. Despite the warnings addressed to the superior of the society, etc., Bishop Alfonso de Galarreta, having committed an act of a schismatic nature through the episcopal consecration of 4 priests without a papal mandate and against the will of the Supreme Pontiff, has ipso facto incurred the penalties provided for in Canon 1387 and 1364, Section 1 of the Code of Canon Law. So let's leave it there. So the first penalty he gives is 1387. Now, what does 1387 say? So, it says, both the bishop who without a pontifical mandate consecrates a person a bishop, and the one who receives the consecration from him incur a late sententia excommunication reserved to the apostolic see. Now, that's very interesting, because this is in the section of canon law where it pertains to offense against the sacraments, which is different. We'll go to the next canon, which is in 1364, which is offense against the unity of the church. So what Cardinal Fernandez is doing here is exactly what happened in 1988. And then we'll go to his explanatory note, which is the same as John Paul II. And then we'll assess that and see if it makes any sense. Because 1364 says, an apostate from the faith, okay, it's not apostasy. A heretic, okay, it's not heresy. Or a schismatic, incurs a late sententia excommunication, etc., etc., etc. But what's interesting about this is that the first penalty given is that of excommunication because by law, without state of necessity, and there are canons that talk about that, which we can talk about, but by law, letter of the law, just the act of consecrating a bishop for Latins, not necessarily for the Easterns in certain cases, but for Latins, you incur an excommunication. But it is not because it is listed as a schism. So, Cardinal Fernandez is applying the penalty for schism for an act that is in the Code of Canon Law in a section that does not deal with schism. So it's the opinion of Cardinal Fernandez. You may agree, you may disagree. It's the opinion of Cardinal Fernandez that it was a schismatic act. And we'll read his explanatory note, and we'll read John Paul II to understand why, but we'll leave it there for now. So let's go back to the letter. I therefore declare for all legal purposes that both the aforementioned Bishop Alfonso de Galarreta and the names of the bishops, so Pascal Schreiber, Michael Goldaddy, Michael Poinsonet de Sivry, and Marc Anapier, have incurred ipso facto the late excommunication reserved to the Apostolic See. So because they were the ones consecrated, which is from Canon 1387. He says, I further declare that Bishop Bernard Fillet has also incurred this penalty. I'm paraphrasing, but that's what it says. And why? Because he was the co-consecrator. Why are there more than one consecrators involved in bishops' consecrations? It's to ensure validity. And historically, it's been 3. Doesn't have to be, but in this case, there were 2. And he goes on to say, clergy and the lay faithful are warned not to join the schism of the priestly fraternity of St. Pius X, as they would thereby incur ipso facto the penalty of latae sententiae excommunication. Now, this is all very scary, isn't it? The thing is, it's the exact same thing as 1988. So, which is fascinating because if we're being technical, absolutely technical, and we'll go through these documents, but if we're being absolutely technical, it was the belief from the letter of Cardinal Gantin in 1988, and then the explanatory letter of John Paul II a couple days later in Ecclesia Dei Afflicta. It was the belief that the priests and the lay people would be guilty of schism. Now, that never passed the test. And technically speaking, and this was pointed out by Cardinal Mueller, like if we want to get really precise with things, the excommunications of the 4 bishops that were still living in 2009 were nullified, but it was never the case that it was ever decreed that there was no longer a schism. But here's the problem. If you're already in schism, you can't be put into one again, because you can't kill a man twice. And furthermore, you can't give faculties to schismatics. And the current Roman hierarchy believes that Orthodox bishops do have jurisdiction, and therefore they do absolve sins validly. So it's all a very incoherent mess. And it is a fact. The letters exist. I have a canon lawyer friend who is in possession of them, and Bishop Fillet has spoken about this, that the bishops of the society were given permission to ordain priests. They were given what are called dimissorial letters, that they had permission from the Holy See to ordain priests, and they would not be penalized, which you can't do with schismatics. So if we're being technical, the schism was never, quote unquote, undeclared, but it was also never real. Unless you believe you can be in schism and not in schism at the same time. And that would be to break the law of non-contradiction, which is logically absurd. All right, let's go to the next one. So here is the explanatory note. This is more similar to John Paul II's letter, Ecclesia Dei Afflicta, and it references Ecclesia Dei Afflicta. Okay. I'm going to skip past the first 2 or 3 sentences because it's just kind of preamble stuff. He goes, therefore, this dicastery, in the faithful exercise, the original is in Italian. I have an English translation, però parlo italiano, posso capire italiano, posso leggere italiano, dunque, io posso dire che questa traduzione è valida. This translation is valid. It says, therefore, this dicastery in the faithful exercise of the functions entrusted to it deems it necessary to note that this act constitutes the delict of schism. Again, declaring that the consecration of bishops de facto is schismatic when The code does not say so. Now, there are varying opinions about whether or not the Pope has to follow canon law. In this case, it's not the Pope, so that's important to remember. It's Cardinal Fernandez. Do you mind if I take a little detour here for a second? As I said, this is going to be a longer podcast. As I said, many of the commentators who have seemingly changed their tune on the society in the last couple weeks, I consider friends. Good friends in some cases, like friends who I've real Christian friends that I love. And I would never want to create any problems or animosity with someone that I love as a Christian brother. So I will not name anyone. At the same time, if a friend believed my soul was at risk, I would want him to tell me. I'm not saying their souls are at risk. What I'm saying is if there were some sort of grave situation, nothing to do with schism, but, I don't know. Like, let's use an example. The modern annulment process is a farce. I mean, there are probably innumerable people out there who have received annulments that are illegitimate, and they're living in an objective state of adultery. Traditional Catholic people would understand that. My wife and I have a wonderful marriage, but let's just say I became a complete and huge, awful jerk, and I said, I'm just sick of this woman, so I want to go get an annulment from a local diocese because that's easier. If I were to do that, I would hope that one of my traditional Catholic friends would talk some sense into me, because I would be an idiot for doing that, and I would hope my friends would help me not be an idiot. Otherwise, what are friends for? Now, in this case, we're dealing with a delicate situation because all of this is happening in the public forum, which in a sense is kind of disordered, but this is the situation we've inherited. So speaking in the public forum is what's happening. And you respond like with like. Now, that being said, I've had many conversations with friends, many conversations behind the scenes. So those have taken place. I'm going to tell a story here, kind of like a parable, to try to explain what I mean. Imagine you have a father and you have two sons. And the father is a very bad father. Maybe he's a drunk. Maybe he's just an adulterer. Maybe he's just a wicked man. And the two sons suffer through that. Now, one of the sons spends a lot of his time telling everybody who can hear, everyone who will listen, that his father is the worst father in the world, maybe the worst father in the history of fathers. His father is a demon worshiper. His father is part of a secret society. His father is a heretic. His father, he facilitates evil men to do evil things. His father may not even be their real father because he's so bad at fathering that he may be an illegitimate father. And the other son, at a certain point, he wants to get married. And even though he knows his father is a wicked man, he understands that it's the father's role to give blessing for marriage. And that's actually a common Catholic teaching, by the way. You can find that in old catechisms, that you're supposed to have permission from your parents. And to not ask for it and to not receive it under normal circumstances would be sinful. It's a usurpation of the authority of the father. When I proposed to my wife, I called her father and her mother and asked for permission first. And they were very happy about that. And I was happy to do it. In any event, this one son says, Dad, I found the love of my life. I would like to spend my life with her. I'd like to raise a family with her. And I'd like to have many children, God willing, baptize them and raise them in the Catholic faith so that we can all go to heaven and be with each other for all eternity. And the father says no. Now, the father's not in his right mind. The son knows it, but he's asking permission anyway. The father has an evil perception of marriage. The father is a wicked man with a terrible moral compass and terrible beliefs about what constitutes the sanctity of marriage, etc. But he asks for permission anyway because he would like to have the father's blessing, all things being equal. The son does not get permission, and the father says, if you do this, you're no longer my son. He kind of expected that, but he knew his dad was kind of out of his mind. Now, the other son, who has been essentially slandering, if it were not true, just running his mouth, telling everybody in the world who will listen that his father is the most evil father in the history of fathers and that the family is in the most awful crisis in the history of crises of families. And that it's it may as well be demon-worshipping, Freemason, lavender mafia, wicked men who constitute the father's inner circle, and they do everything together. And when his brother comes to him and says, I'm going to marry her anyway because Dad's just wrong on this and I don't reject his authority, but for some reason he's just not capable of making the right decision, and his prohibition because of all of these circumstances is illegitimate. Now, what does the other son do? The one who's been roasting the dad publicly for a decade or his whole life. He says, you disobedient son, you're not obedient to dad. You're no longer part of this family. It's a feeling of great betrayal. Because the son who is in principle going forth with the good and holy thing is now the black sheep, when it is the other brother who has spent much of his life fomenting and encouraging an understanding of the state of crisis within the family. But when push comes to shove, to do something that would actually edify the sons, he sides with the father who he has not shown respect for forever. That's the parable I want to tell. Okay, back to the letter. Okay, so Cardinal Fernandez, he says, this is the delict of schism with the canonical consequences for the sacred ministers and lay faithful involved. In fact, as already stated in 1988, this is where it's interesting. He says, such disobedience, so appealing to 1988, he's saying it's an act of disobedience. He said, entails a practical rejection of the Roman primacy and constitutes a schismatic act. And then he cites Ecclesia de Adflicta, paragraph 3, which I will show you so we can read it together. This is John Paul II. He says, in itself, this act was one of disobedience to the Roman pontiff in a very grave matter and of supreme importance for the unity of the church, such as is the ordination of bishops, whereby the apostolic succession is sacramentally perpetuated. Hence, such disobedience, which implies in practice the rejection of the Roman primacy, constitutes a schismatic act. And for his citation there, he goes to the Code of Canon Law, and what he does is he cites Canon 751, which talks about schism being the rejection of the Roman primacy. or failure or refusal of submission to the Pope. So what's interesting about this is that Pope John Paul II and Cardinal Fernandez after him have gone from an act of disobedience to a general refusal of submission to the Roman primacy, which is quite the leap. It's quite the leap. Disobedience to one's father does not mean a de facto refusal to submit to one's father. It means disobedience. You have to take the person as a whole and the actions as a whole. But they didn't do it in 1988, and they're not doing it in 2026. There is some tragic irony in the fact that Dom Pagliarani said that the society was going forth with the consecrations on February 2nd, which is Candlemas, but it's also Groundhog Day. So maybe a little humor in there somehow. Okay, back to the letter from Fernandez. It says this: sacred ministers belonging to the priestly fraternity of SSPX are in schism and must therefore be considered schismatics. A couple things are interesting about this. From now on, little victories here and there. The anti-SSPX commentary crowd has been arguing for decades that the priests of the SSPX are in schism. But apparently they weren't. So I would hope that those of you out there who do what you do for the love of the church, because I hope that's why you do it, I would hope that you would publicly apologize for calumniating 750 priests for the last decade with your commentary, because in fact you had been lying to the faithful. Because they weren't in schism, because apparently they now are, but they weren't before. Fascinating. And it now refers to Ecclesia Dei, paragraph 5c. We'll read that. Because here is why I'm saying that it's the same as 1988. So, Ecclesia Dei, paragraph 5c. It says, this is John Paul II. In the present circumstances, I wish especially to make an appeal both solemn and heartfelt, paternal and fraternal, to all those who until now have been linked in various ways to the movement of Archbishop Lefebvre, that they may fulfill the grave duty of remaining united to the Vicar of Christ in the unity of the Catholic Church and of ceasing their support in any way for that movement. Ceasing support in any way. That includes those of you who don't attend the SSPX, but agree with the consecrations. By the logic of Ecclesia Dei and the logic of Cardinal Fernandez, citing Ecclesia Dei as the source material, anyone who supports in any way that movement is a schismatic. It says, everyone should be aware that formal adherence to the schism is a grave offense against God and carries the penalty of excommunication decreed by the Church's law. So anyone, it says two different things here. If you support the movement of Archbishop Lefebvre, as it's called, you might be a schismatic. And if you formally adhere to the schism, you are a schismatic. We'll talk about formal adherence because Cardinal Fernandez cites something else. So I'll bring up what he cites here. So he first cites Ecclesia Dei number 5c, which we just read. Then he cites Pontifical Council for Legislative Texts, that's a department, explanatory note on the excommunication for schism incurred by members of Bishop Marcel Lefebvre's movement. August 24th, 1996, paragraphs 5 and 6. So let's read that. Now, what's interesting, though, is so often in these conversations about this topic, there is a lot of talking past each other Archbishop Lefebvre denied a zillion times that he was the leader of a movement. Nonetheless, against his express will and intentions, those who attended the SSPX or supported it were labeled as being part of a movement that Archbishop Lefebvre himself denied existing. A lot of talking past each other. Anyway, here is the thing here. So let me just make sure we get this correct. So Cardinal Fernandez quotes this document, and it's paragraphs 5 and 6. What does the document say? As stated in motu proprio, so that's the short form for the motu proprio that they're referring to, which is Ecclesia Dei Flicta, we should give a brief note on a motu proprio. Traditionis Custodes was a motu proprio. So for all you traditional Catholic commentators out there who have been arguing for the illegitimacy of Traditionis Custodes, because it's a motu proprio, and what is a motu proprio? A motu proprio is essentially a memo or a policy document. It's not a papal bull or a declaration of infallibly of a council or even an expression of the universal ordinary magisterium. It has a very low magisterial weight because it's not strictly magisterial, because it's more administrative. It's essentially an administrative document. So I do find that there is a significant amount of hypocrisy right now, because if we're being technical, I am not a theologian, but what I am is I am a teacher. That is what I was trained to. That's what I did for years. And then I transitioned into writing and podcasting through a series of providential circumstances. And I do not pretend to be a theologian, just like when I taught French and Spanish and history and geography and religion. I did not pretend to be an officially PhD'd French linguist. Mais bien sûr, je parle français très bien, mais je n'étais pas seulement un enseignant de français. I speak French well, but I was a French teacher. I wasn't a French master. Nonetheless, I could read what comes from French mastery, and I could present it to my students, because I do my due diligence to ensure that what I present will not be held against me at my particular judgment. Like all of you, I am a terrible sinner, and I have many sins in my life that I have to atone for. And the last thing, as God is my witness, that I will ever do is do something to present to you information simply to convince you for the sake of being right. That is a really stupid way to go to hell, and I don't do what I do so I can lose my soul. So I'm not a theologian. I'm not a canon lawyer. So what I do is, behind the scenes, I correspond with a number of canon lawyers and theologians. Not all SSPX, by the way. Just people that I believe are good priests and good canonists and good, properly trained theologians. Not every priest is a theologian either, in the sense that they're not trained adequately in the science of theology to be considered officially a theologian of the church. And I have a number of theologians that I communicate with that are laymen who have like pontifical degrees, as well as priests. Some who are society priests and some who are not society priests. I even have bishops who I communicate with, if you can imagine that, non-SSPX bishops. I've actually never had personal interaction beyond shaking hands with Bishop Tissier de Malloret, God rest his soul, and Bishop Fillet. I've never had actually any correspondence with any bishops of the society. I have had more correspondence with bishops who are not in the society, including Bishop Schneider, but others who I will not name because they support the SSPX, which by the logic of this document, they may be excommunicated. Anyway, I transmit to you what the people who have the right to know and the ability to know tell me. I just want to make that clear. Okay. So here's where it gets interesting. It says, as stated in Motu Proprio 5c, late sententia excommunicated. Oh, sorry. I was going on about hypocrisy. If we are being technical, which we should be, because if we're going to be talking about schism and stuff, we need to get it right. We cannot claim ignorance if we are opening our mouths publicly. It's not going to work. We don't have to open our mouths publicly, but if we are going to open our mouths publicly, then we're going to be held accountable for what we say. So if we don't know what we're talking about, then we better get it right. Or we better keep our mouths shut, I should say. A motu proprio is a policy document. And let me actually read you something to buttress what I'm saying. So again, you don't have to trust me, but instead you can trust the mind of the church, because my words are meaningless unless they happen to say true things, but that doesn't come from me. So I have notes that I keep on hand to make sure that when I say things that I don't say wrong things, because I'm an idiot, and I would do that if I didn't refer to the relevant sources. Here is notes I've basically compiled and about the different documents and what constitutes the various doctrinal authority because of both the documents and the content. So just so we can all be clear here, don't listen to Kennedy Hall, listen to the church. Kennedy Hall's a moron. Church is not. All right, so here are the notes that I have, and just so everyone's clear, these notes, what I'm going to share with you here, it's a combination of essentially the perennial authors of manuals and whatnot, including men like Van Noort, Saliveri, commentators on canon law, a lot of important theologians who would represent the teaching of the church. This isn't my ideas, but here are the basic types of documents that come out. So considered to be in the highest category, we have apostolic constitutions. Those have historically been used for ex cathedra definitions. Not always, but historically. We also have what are called papal bulls. These historically, aside from ex cathedra definitions, are historically seen as the most solemn instrument for irrevocable definitive matters. And the word bull comes from bulla, which means lead seal. So it's sealed. So we have to understand these differences, because a lot of time people will say things like, oh, it's an encyclical, da-da-da-da. Well, it's not always. Encyclical is a general word because it refers to something that is sort of cycled throughout, but there are differences between them. Then you have things that are called papal briefs. These are a lesser, more expeditious form of releasing a document. These are usually used for matters of lesser solemnity, dispensations, minor appointments, indults, and so forth. Then we have encyclicals, which most of us are familiar with. And these are a circular letter to the bishops, and since the 19th century, even to the faithful as such. Now, this is the ordinary papal magisterium by default. So a classic example of this is Pius XII's Humani Generis. So when a pope in encyclicals deliberately passes judgment on a point until then debated among theologians, the matter can no longer rise to the level of can be considered a question of free theological dispute. This was talked about by Pius XII. Even though the encyclical does not rise to the level of a solemn ex cathedra definition. So on the one hand, we can't say encyclicals are like the highest thing. On the other hand, we can't say it's just an encyclical, because it's the content that's important. You still have to find out whether the Pope is proposing something definitively. Then we have what are called apostolic exhortations. These are generally the weakest doctrinal category among the major genres. And I want to just pause here for a second. These types of documents have developed over the centuries for clarity's sake, so we can kind of know exactly what's happening. In the early centuries of the church, a lot of things were just kind of released with letters, kind of like St. Paul. There's letters from the first head of the Holy Office, and then letters of Peter. Obviously, all those letters are inspired. But then after that, shortly after, we have like the various saints that becomes popes, like Clement and men like this. And there wasn't a pure distinction between like what kind of letter should be released to refer to what. So there had to be a lot of work done to sort of tease out what exactly is doctrinal and what is maybe disciplinary, etc. So over the years, the reason why these different letters are used is to make that more clear, so we can deal with it more easily. So apostolic exhortations are generally the weakest. So especially post-conciliar period, and a lot to do with the synod on synodality, these exhortations tend to be pastoral and programmatic rather than binding acts of teaching. They summarize whatever's been deliberated, basically. This is not a hard rule. Again, a pope could release an email and use the proper form and define something, but that's just not how it's done. But it is the dominant pattern. So this is why, for example, documents like Amoris Laetitia generate such dispute, because the genre itself carries a lower presumption of doctrinal definition, which is precisely what makes it ambiguous. So you have to go to the content. And this is why we are in this state of ambiguity. And there's a lot of apostolic exhortations that come out because of exactly what we're talking about. And then under apostolic exhortations, we have motu proprios. So the motu proprio, it's the Pope. It means on his own initiative, motu proprio, like personal motive, basically. And it's without the request of a dicastery or petitioner. So this is kind of what might be called a mode of proposal. And motu proprios are typically legislative and administrative. They alter things like canon law. They erect or suppress structures. So they might be about an indult for the Mass or something like that. They can carry doctrinal content, but usually don't. Or if they do, they certainly don't define. And I can't think of a motu proprio that actually defines teaching in a definitive sense. They're meant to govern. So they're largely legislative. Then there's apostolic letters, kind of a catch-all term, ranging from Ordinatio Sacerdotalis, which was John Paul II's document on women's ordination, but Ratzinger's Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith commentary at the time on that, responding to dubia about it, and he held it to pertain the ordinary universal magisterium as an infallibly held truth, even though the letter itself wasn't ex cathedra and so forth. Then we have allocutions, addresses, angelus reflections, general audience catechesis. Now, then we also have decrees, which is what this is from Cardinal Fernandez. Decrees, instructions, rescripts, or declarations. So these are issued by Roman dicasteries, CDF, DDF, etc. Not the Pope personally, though with his authority, vicariously, so to speak. So these are administrative or disciplinary, and they instruct, or they intend to instruct, and apply principles to existing law or doctrine to particular circumstances. So declaration expresses the mind of the dicastery on a disputed point. So the binding force is canonical and administrative. It is not dogmatic. Let's keep that in mind. Unless explicitly approved by the Pope in forma specifica, which elevates it to a papal act proper. Nonetheless, if it remains a legislative thing, it's still not dogmatic. So if the content of it is canonical, it's not dogmatic. I hope that makes sense. So then we must also discuss really briefly, we have the theological notes that grade the binding character of teaching. So we have De Fide Divina et Catholica, which is formally revealed and defined, and to deny that is heresy. We have Fide Ecclesiastica, which is infallibly taught by the ordinary universal magisterium, though not formally in the deposit of revelation. So that's an example is something like We know that angels exist from the scriptures, but if I'm not mistaken, and this is just an example, there are many examples, this is top of my head. I don't think it's been defined de fide by the church what the nature of an angel is, but it's the received tradition that's always been believed by all that they're pure spirits. So that's kind of like the ordinary universal magisterium. We have sententia fide proxima, which is commonly held as revealed, not yet formally defined. We have theologica certa, a theological conclusion, certain connected to revealed truth by necessary inference. We have doctrina catholica sententia communis, which is authoritative common teaching, which is owed religious assent, which is not the same thing as the assent of faith. I'm not saying you should look for reasons not to, but the distinctions matter. And then we have sententia probabilis or opinio tolerata. So these are free theological opinion of varying degrees. An example of that, if I'm not mistaken, is if Judas received Holy Communion at the Last Supper. For some reason, that's debated. I don't know. Now, what are the grades of assent owed? Now, this is where this is where the types of documents really matter and what their intention is. So in the first category, we have dogma solemnly defined. So extraordinary magisterium through councils, ordinary universal magisterium, things that are of divine faith and fides divina and catholica, theological faith. These are irrevocable. To deny them is heresy or at least grave error. Then we have authoritative but non-infallible ordinary magisterium. So this is typical encyclical content, to be specific. Now, again, you have to assess what's in the encyclical, but typical encyclical content. Also things like doctrinal apostolic letters that are not meeting the conditions for infallibility. These are real documents. They're not optional, technically, but theoretically reformable. And this is why you could say the documents of Vatican II could be reformed, because they don't meet the criteria for these dogmatically, solemnly defined documents. So Cardinal Fernandez is wrong that you can't reform it, because you actually could. And the general manualists in the preconciliar period held that submission does not extend to matters where the teaching would itself conflict with previously defined dogmas, which again also includes the ordinary universal magisterium. Because a Catholic is not bound to assent to what contradicts the faith merely because it's issued from legitimate authority in a non-definitive way. And then finally, we have what are called disciplinary and administrative legislative things. And this is most motu proprios, like this one from Fernandez. Instructions, decrees, like this from Fernandez. Sorry, the motu proprio is from the Pope. The decree is from Cardinal Fernandez. So these, in general, require canonical obedience because they're acts of law, but not doctrinal assent. So this is largely a juridical category, and juridical acts can be resisted because they're acts of human law. They're not acts of divine faith. As long as you have proper cause, and when you do so, you're not actually touching on the deposit of faith at all. So obedience to law admits of the classical conditions for licit resistance to unjust or gravely harmful legislation. And canonists like Verns Vidal and others, who are great heroes of the canonical tradition, would admit things like epikeia, which is the best translation is equity, so the law to be done justly, and to basically take into account the goodwill of the people and give benefit of the doubt, is the best way of putting it, and to apply the law in a way that takes that into consideration. And the state of necessity, which we'll talk about later in the podcast. Okay, I wanted to talk about that. As I said, this is going to be a long podcast, but there's a lot going on. So when we're referring to these documents, Ecclesia Dei Flicta, the decree from Cardinal Fernandez, according to the mind of the church, you can actually disagree with them. You can. I don't remember where I was, but I believe we were going over the explanatory note. Yes, that's what we were doing, from the Pontifical Legislative Text document. So let's bring that up again. So, back to it. Yes, this is what was cited by Cardinal Fernandez in his explanatory note. He's referring to this document from the Pontifical Council for Legislative Texts. And remember, if I just make sure I get the terms right here, he says, sacred ministers belonging to the SSPX are in schism and must therefore be considered schismatics. And then he appeals to this Ecclesiae 5c. Ecclesiae 5c, which let's read that again to make sure. Right here, he says, in the present circumstances, anyone linked in various ways to the movement of Archbishop Lefebvre, that they may just keep being Catholic, blah, 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 cease supporting in any way that movement, which is very broad. And it says right here, everyone should be aware that formal adherence to the schism is a grave offense against God and carries the penalty of excommunication. So this is why I'm saying it's the same as 1988. It's saying the same thing because he cites, Fernandez is citing this it's so confusing. I wish they would just use things in straightforward ways, but he's citing this Pontifical Council for Legislative Text document, which then cites Ecclesia Dei Flicta. Okay. And what does it say? And again, Fernandez in his thing is saying, go to the Pontifical Council document and go to paragraphs 5 and 6. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go to paragraphs 5 and 6. Okay. As stated in motu proprio, which we just went through the whole list of motu proprio, like what all the documents mean. You can disagree with the motu proprio and not be some sort of heretic. You can even resist it for a state of necessity and not be some sort of schismatic, according to the tradition. It says, lete sententia excommunication for schism concerns those who formally adhere to the said schismatic movement. Although the question regarding the exact scope of the notion of formal adherence to the schism should be referred to the competent Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, it seems to this Pontifical Council that such adherence must imply two complementary elements. So what's interesting about this, Cardinal Fernandez, if I bring up his document, he says, where does he say it in here? Okay. He says in the next paragraph that we'll get to, but I'll talk about it, he says, that remains in force, and the dicastery makes it its own. So he's referring to this document on the screen right here. But again, it's fascinating because this document seems to imply that the priests would be in schism. And he said it remained in force as if it were still in force. But somehow the priests are now in schism from now on, but they weren't before, which contradicts the documents. It's just classic post-Vatican II insanity. Anyway. So there's two ways, and Fernandez says that the dicastery, that he says that document was always in force. What level of force we don't know because it didn't actually practically apply. And now the dicastery is making it its own. You see the major problem here with these men is that they don't know how to reason. They don't know how to. It's like a web of confusion and a conflation of different levels of things. And it's just kind of like throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. But when you actually start to break it down, it starts to get very ridiculous. Because if we break this down like a normal person, what he's basically saying is that on the one hand, he's saying the priests of the SSPX from now on are schismatic. So they weren't before. But then in the next breath, he says this document that explains why they're schismatics remains in force, which means they must have been schismatic, but they weren't because from now on they are. And he says, and now we make this document our own. It's very confusing. It's what you'd expect. So, and then in the document, it says we would have to have the CDF comment on this, but it seems to this council, so it's not even certain, it seems to this council that formal adherence must imply two complementary elements. A, one of an internal nature consisting in freely and consciously sharing the substance of the schism, whatever that means. So if you go to the Fraternity of St. Peter and you say, yeah, go for it, Dom Palirani, you might actually be considered a schismatic. This is very strange. This is not in line with the tradition of the church either, because, like, for example, when you read Bellarmine on heresy and whatnot, occult heretics cannot be judged in the external form. Like, so basically you can't judge a man's heart. You don't actually know why he believes it, etc. It has to be, anyway. So the internal element is really strange. And yes, referring to Bellarmine, I can foresee objections. Referring to Bellarmine does apply when it comes to heresy, because in the Code of Canon Law, heresy, apostasy, and schism are put together. So there's your answer. So it says, consciously sharing in the substance of the schism, that is, in opting in such a way for the followers of Lefebvre that this option is placed above obedience to the Pope. At the root of this attitude, there will usually be positions contrary to the magisterium of the Church. Well, there are not positions contrary to the magisterium of the Church in the SSPX, which was evidenced by their profession of faith. So it's very speculative. So the Dicastery of the Doctrine of the Faith is making its own, a document that explains how maybe under certain circumstances, if we speculate, it may be the case that you deny teachings of the Church. It's just ridiculous. It says, B, another of an external nature consisting in the externalization of that opinion, the most evident sign of which will be the exclusive participation in the Lefebvrean ecclesial acts. Again, there's no such thing as Lefebvrean. That's a made-up term. So that would include things, exclusively without taking part in the acts of the Catholic Church. So I don't even know how you define that. So, like, I exclusively go to the SSPX for Mass where I live. If I'm traveling, I go to the SSPX. But, like, I'll go to a wedding of someone getting married, not at the SSPX, or a funeral. Or, like, recently, a nephew was baptized by some Oratorians. I went to that. And when we prayed the Our Father, like, we walked up, it was kind of the Oratorians are interesting because they kind of do things in like a half trad, half new way. I really like the Oratorians. I think it's a beautiful order. But anyway, so I don't even know what this means. Like, I don't even know if this would apply to me. If you go to Eucharistic adoration at a Novus Ordo chapel, let's say, is that some sort of ecclesial act? I mean, it's a ceremony, and you're just assuming the Eucharist is consecrated properly, so you're there to adore Christ, and it's not really a liturgy, but I don't know. And he says, however, this is this is a non-univocal sign, since there is the possibility that some faithful may take part in the liturgical functions of Lefebvre's followers without sharing their schismatic spirit. So as God is my witness, I have no schismatic spirit. I mean, you can deny that because you read my soul, but I'm telling you as the guy with the soul that I don't have a schismatic spirit. I love the Pope. I pray for him every day. You may think my way of showing it is funny, but a son can love his father even if his father doesn't recognize the son, and that's not my fault. I don't know what to tell you. And it says to go paragraphs 5 and 6, so we'll read paragraph 6. And it says, in the case of the Lefebvrean deacons and priests, it seems clear that their ministerial activity within the schism, it seems clear, it's not clear, it seems clear, within the schismatic movement is a more than evident sign that the two requirements mentioned above are met and that there is therefore formal adherence. So this is why I'm saying this is the same as 1988. John Paul II's letter, if we bring that up again, everyone should be aware that formal adherence to the schism is a grave offense and carries the penalty of excommunication. So the logic of John Paul II's letter is that the priests of the SSPX were in schism anyway, and they're excommunicated anyway. So if we're going letter of the law, the four bishops the excommunications were nullified, but they could never nullify the excommunications of the priests because they were never declared. It was just implied. But then the priests were dealt with as if they were not excommunicated or in schism because they had regular interactions. They were in some cases even penalized, and when there was a couple derelict priests in the society, they were penalized by the church as priests of the church, so you can't not be in the church. Like, the church doesn't penalize Orthodox priests or Anglican priests if they have any valid priests still, because they're not in the church. And then they had the permission for ordinations and things, which is documented. it's all very confusing. And the reason I'm going through these documents point by point is because you need to see that these decrees don't have coherence. They just don't. So how do you follow something properly when you don't have coherence? And it seems to be internally you could somehow be guilty of excommunication, which is very strange. It's very strange. Because if you support Archbishop Lefebvre, even if you don't attend their masses, then you could be an excommunicated person. Maybe. Who knows? Because they're thinking that maybe at the root of their attitude, there will be positions contrary to the magisterium of the church. So if you attend the Fraternity of St. Peter and you support the SSPX and what they just did or had supported them, by this document, you may have been excommunicated. I bet you didn't know that, did you? But of course you weren't. Because that's just stupid. Because you don't hold any positions contrary to the magisterium. In fact, I think we can be pretty certain that it's in the average parish where the vast majority of people hold positions contrary to the magisterium. So who else does this apply to? Is it the case if you support Archbishop Lefebvre and the bishops now? Because what we talked about, motu proprios, we talked about all these things. These are legislative acts with which you can disagree, according to the tradition of the church. But you also don't disagree with the magisterium of the church, which is the most important because it's the faith. But if, let's say, you go to a Novus Ordo parish and you don't support, well, maybe you do, but I'm just saying hypothetically, you don't support and you do think the SSPX are schismatics, but you hold positions contrary to the magisterium of the church, because the logic of this is that they're thinking that Lefebvreists, etc., will basically be heretics, but they're not. So I guess, one of the things, sometimes it's very strange to me because, there's this thing called the gospel. I don't know if you've heard of it. And it's actually a collection of sayings and actions of our Lord Jesus Christ, and it was dictated by the Holy Ghost, and it's infallible, and we can never deny it. I didn't know if you knew that or not. And if you read the words of our Lord, he's very clear that the spirit of the law is the most important. So when the letter contradicts the spirit, we've got a big problem. And if you read the Gospel of Luke, our Lord says very clearly, "Woe to you lawyers who place burdens," I'm paraphrasing, but place burdens upon the shoulders of your subjects, and then you lift not a finger to help them. Woe means you're going to hell. I mean, how else are we supposed to view this? Talk about intellectual burdens, talk about confusion, talk about ambiguity. How is anyone to make sense of this? Because if you accept it de facto, that someone is liable to excommunication because they internally have a belief that Archbishop Lefebvre and the bishops now did the right thing, according to this pontifical document for legislative texts, it seems that you may be excommunicated. But the tradition of the church does not support this. So if you want to remain a traditionalist in good standing, you have to accept theological novelty that is not supported by the tradition in order to remain a traditionalist. You cannot be contradictory things at the same time. It makes no sense. Okay. So we read that part. Now let's go back to let's go back to Cardinal Fernandez. With regard to the lay faithful, those who formally adhere to the priestly are to be considered schismatic and excommunicated under the conditions established in the explanatory note. Issued Well, what's interesting, I just saw this. I'm sorry. This document, I won't get into it. It says, the lay faithful who formally adhere, and we looked at formal adherence. What does it mean? Who knows? If you go to the Fraternity of St. Peter and think it was right, maybe you formally adhere. You'll never know if you're excommunicated or not. It's so stupid. Anyway, are to be considered schismatic and excommunicated under the conditions established in the explanatory note issued, so the thing we just read. And then it goes to paragraph 7. So we have to now look at paragraph 7. What does paragraph 7 say? In the case of the other faithful, however, not the priests. I'll highlight this. It is obvious that occasional participation in liturgical acts or activities of the Lefebvrean movement without adopting the movement's attitude of doctrinal and disciplinary disunity. So again, it's assumed that the SSPX are doctrinally unsound, which is an untenable position. My friends, whatever you think about the SSPX, you have to be an idiot to suggest the SSPX does not believe the necessary teachings of the church. That's just stupid. It says, without adopting the movement's doctrinal and disciplinary disunity is not sufficient to constitute formal membership in the movement. In pastoral practice, it may be more difficult to assess their situation. It is necessary to take into account above all the individual's intention and the translation of this interior disposition into action. The various situations must therefore be assessed on a case-by-case basis in the competent bodies of the external and internal forums. So what is this saying? Cardinal Fernandez is contradicting himself because this document contradicts itself. Cardinal Fernandez says, the lay faithful are to be considered schismatic, and then cites the document, which says, well, we don't really know, so it has to be case by case. So you are maybe a schismatic, you're maybe not a schismatic, you're maybe excommunicated, you're maybe not excommunicated, and the only way we can really find out is there has to be a case-by-case basis with the competent bodies of the external and internal forums. So basically that would mean with confessors and with judges. So if I'm a schismatic, I'm going to have to be, I'm going to have to get a letter from Rome or something. And then if I do get a letter from Rome, I'm going to have the right of appeal, and there's going to have to be a case. So nothing is clarified by this. It's the exact same as 1988. That's kind of the point I'm getting at here. He said, next he goes, finally, the holy people of God are hereby warned that the sacred ministers of the SSPX administer the sacraments illicitly, and that the sacrament of penance administered by them and the marriages assisted to them are invalid. Two things are interesting. Number one, the holy people of God. Is that the Catholic Church? I don't know. It doesn't say. Secondly, he actually can't declare all of their sacraments invalid when it comes to marriage and confession. Because Cardinal Fernandez, as such, does not have the ability to override the Code of Canon Law. And I'll just read you one of the canons, just to be clear. Not that, again, I'm kind of getting sick of, anyway, woe to you lawyers, remember that. I mean, you got to go. You can't cite canon law the same way a Protestant will cite Scripture. It has to be taken in the context, and it has to be compatible with the faith. Legalism is not a good thing. Canon 1335. So here you go. If a censure prohibits the celebration of the sacraments or sacramentals, or the performing of acts of the power of governance, so that is marriage and confession. The prohibition is suspended whenever this is necessary to provide for the faithful who are in danger of death. That's one option. So it's even if we take it strictly, Fernandez can't say that because an SSPX priest could absolve someone who is sick, very sick. If a late sententia censure has not been declared, and for a late sententia censure to be declared, you have to name the person. You have to name the person. It's not enough to say they are. You have to name the person because the church's laws, they have to be given right of defense. You have to name the person. The prohibition is also suspended whenever one of the faithful requests a sacrament or sacramental, so that would be a sacrament. Quite frankly, that's Mass and baptism, and basically last rites. Those are the ones that aren't jurisdictional generally. Or, technically speaking, confirmation, I guess. The prohibition is suspended whenever one of the faithful requests a sacrament or sacramental, which I guess would be something like a house blessing or the blessing of items. Or technically, no, exorcism wouldn't work because that's a sacramental, but that requires jurisdiction. But I guess maybe it would apply, although the SSPX, I don't think they do exorcisms anyway. Anyway, I'm digressing. Or it says, or an act of the power of governance, which is confession or marriage. It says, it is lawful to make such a request. So if we take Cardinal Fernandez's thing letter of the law here, we do have to ignore the Code of Canon Law. So we're required to follow the law by ignoring the law. Does that make any sense? It's not supposed to make sense. It's the new springtime. Continues. The church as a caring mother, so caring under Cardinal Fernandez, will welcome with sincere affection and deep concern all those who wish to return to full communion. So they were in full communion. I thought they were in schism. We were told they were in schism by all the idiots on the internet for years. Again, let's wait for their apology. They won't. The apostolic nuncios will establish the procedures that the ordinaries may use in various cases. So that's basically like if a priest wants to leave this SPX. Finally, all the faithful are urged to remain firm in communion with the Roman Pontiff, with the bishops in communion with him, etc., 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 and to refrain from participating in celebrations and activities promoted by the aforementioned SSPX. Although the letter that he cites says that, well, you could go and you might not be a schismatic anyway. So let's break this down here. Many people started going to the SSPX during COVID because they believed there was a necessity. According to Cardinal Fernandez, two things are happening at the same time. Number one, they are now considered schismatics. Number two, they were somehow already, by the logic of the document, which he said was always in force, already schismatics. So now they're double schism. It's like a double stuffed Oreo. Now, I want to be clear here. It is possible for somebody to commit the same crime twice. But it's not possible for someone to be in schism and not be in schism at the same time. And it is not possible for someone who's in schism to then go into schism again if they're already in it. You can't kill a man twice. So how does one make sense of this? I don't know. You can't make sense of it. So if you stuck with me this far, God bless you. If you'd like to be edified in your Catholic faith, I'm going to Mexico in December with a priest of the SSPX who may or may not be in schism and may or may not have been a schismatic and may now be a schismatic or may or may not be at the same time in the same place, with a group of faithful who may or may not adhere formally to a schism that may or may not exist at the same time in the same place. All that aside, we're going to go to the great sites of Catholic devotion in Mexico, specifically focused on the heroism of the Cristero martyrs, and I'd like you to come with me if you enjoy doing so, and the link for that is underneath. It's in December, great way to prepare for Christmas. So I'd also like to thank Cardinal Fernandez. I'm sorry. I'd like to thank Cardinal Fernandez for confirming the state of necessity in the church. And we're going to go through that now. So I'm going to read from some documents here. I didn't have time to print them off. But I like to use notes because I don't want to say the wrong thing. Let me just do this for you here. Open up my drive. Boom. So, state of necessity. So let's go through a state of necessity and let's go through some common objections because this is kind of the matter at hand. So many Catholic commentators or traditional Catholic sympathizers have essentially argued that while 1988 may have been okay, 2026 is a step too far, essentially. And the reason being is that there are more traditional masses available now than there were then, even with Traditionis Custodes, and because we have like the FSSP and stuff, the SSPX doesn't need to exist. Now, inherent in that argumentation is an admission that there can be a state of necessity. So let's just keep that in mind. So we need to address what a state of necessity is. So, a core definition, I took this from Father Glaze, and this definition from Father Glaze, just to make sure I get this right, this definition from Father Glaze is a synthesis. Let me make sure I tell you exactly who it is here. Hold on. Looking for my footnote. Sorry, I wrote a 20-page article. It's hard to find them. Okay. This is a synthesis of, well, I'll tell you what. I'll link the article underneath, and I have all the footnotes. What I'm going to tell you here is basically a condensed version of that if you're not much of a reader. If you'd like to know who it is, it's a ton of different theological manuals and so forth that explain this. So, okay. In any event, a state of necessity is an extraordinary situation in which the necessaries of natural or supernatural life are threatened in such a way that to safeguard them, one finds oneself habitually obliged to break the law in order to get these goods. If the application of the law goes against the end of the law intended by the legislators, it is no longer legitimate because it is self-contradictory. So, I'll add something there too. Not only are they obliged to break the law, but in the church, the whole edifice of ecclesiastical law is by definition ordered to the preaching of the doctrine of the faith and the administration of sacraments. So the subjects can and must take no notice of particular acts of the law in order to obtain the end of the law, despite the authorities who apply the law contradictory to it. So that's the basics of a state of necessity. And it can be for natural ends and it can be for supernatural ends. A natural end, where the state of necessity is commonly invoked, is, we'll go through these I'm getting ahead of myself. We also have to understand there's something called legal positivism, which I think is infecting a lot of commentators. one of the reasons why I think that the legal positivist mentality is so common amongst not just Americans, more amongst Americans, but in general amongst Anglo speakers, is because our Anglo nations, whether Canada, USA, etc., we've inherited this post-Reformation legal positivism because our nations were founded by Englishmen, essentially, who were not Catholic, and they adopted the legal positivism, which stemmed from the liberalism, which is the fruit of Protestantism. Because in Protestantism, there is no tradition and there is no real hierarchy, so you essentially have to enforce the law for the sake of it, otherwise you have anarchy, and that's where legal positivism sort of comes from. But as Catholics, we would look to men like Aquinas and others who would say, they all say the same thing, that an unjust law is no law. The reason being is because Catholics have historically understood that a code of law is subject to the metaphysical principles that undergird the law. So if the code works against those, it's illegitimate. It's like if you say, my son is educated, he has a master's, and you say, oh, what did he study? Lesbian dance theory. Your son is not educated. No, he has a master's. He has the paper that says he's educated, but he didn't learn anything worth knowing. So he's not educated. The principle of education is higher than the certification. Same thing with the law. So there are 5 degrees of spiritual necessity. The first is that's what's called ordinary or common. This is the state of any sinner in ordinary circumstances. So any sinner is under the necessity of confession. There's what's called grave. And this is where spiritual goods of great importance are threatened. There's what's called almost extreme. A soul could be rescued only with great difficulty and without help. This is basically someone who needs to convert on their deathbed. There's what's called extreme. A soul cannot be saved without help, or salvation is morally impossible without it. This is more someone on their deathbed who needs to convert. The one I said before is more like someone who is a Catholic, has been away from the church, but wants absolution. So he's not without faith per se, but he's on death's door and needs help pretty quickly. And there's what's called grave, general, or public necessity. And this is where several souls, not necessarily all, several, are threatened in spiritual goods of great importance. So canonists historically would cite epidemics and the public spreading of heresy as classic examples. So plague for the body and plague for the soul are both under this category. Now, I think it's arguable, very obviously so, that the 5th one, the grave, general, and public, applies to the church as such right now because of the spreading of heresy. It doesn't have to be universal, but it affects several, so a large number. Not everyone at every non-SSPX parish or chapel, forgive me, not everyone is at risk of hearing heresy from the pulpit. Or not everyone at every non-SSPX school is at risk of hearing bad Catholic doctrine in the classroom. But it is a general state that applies to several souls all over. It's the 5th degree. These 5 degrees of necessity are the undergirding for example, that canon that we read, where it talks about even a suspended priest or whatever could give someone, they could be approached for a sacrament for a just cause, because those are all just causes. I mean, and it's pretty broad. Like, let's take the first one, ordinary or common. So this is the state of any sinner in ordinary circumstances. You know, like, I don't know. If you were going to fly, you know, I always like to go to confession before I get on an airplane. It's more likely to get into a car accident than you are in a plane crash, but nonetheless, a plane crash usually results in death. Not all car crashes do. So before I'm going to fly, I like to go to confession. That's an ordinary or common state of necessity, spiritual necessity. You need to have your sins absolved. And then you get more grave from there. So we have much evidence for today, the present state of this universal spiritual deprivation. If you need evidence for that, just open your eyes and look around. There's a global collapse in the Catholic faith. And it's because of the spreading of heresy. It's not just about clown masses or whatever. It's just everywhere. Okay, so if there is a state of necessity, then we have to ask ourselves, is there anything that can be done and what must be done? So we'll go through 4 different popes here that talk about this. So Pius X, at the start of the 20th century, talked about the spreading of modernism, and he talked about it. He said the danger is, this is from Pascendi, he says the danger is present in almost the very veins of the heart of the church. So it's like near the heart, it's so bad. And he was saying this 120 years ago. That's a spiritual plague. It's the synthesis of all heresies, and Pius X said, it strikes at the root of the faith itself, not just the branches. So it goes at the foundation. That's very grave. Leo XIII in Sapientiae Christianae, and this is in 1890. And this is on the duty of Christians when they're in a state of crisis. And he says, when necessity compels, his words, not only those who are invested with power of rule are bound to safeguard the integrity of the faith, but each one is under obligation to show forth his faith. Now, this document was addressed primarily with the intention of talking to basically Catholic leaders, not necessarily churchmen, but the spiritual is higher than the natural, so the duties of bishops and cardinals and popes is more severe and more grave than the duties of heads of state. So the principles, if they can apply to the lower, the logic also goes to the higher because of the duty inherent therein. He also says in the same encyclical, he says, to recoil before an enemy or to keep silence when from all sides such clamors are raised against truth is the part of a man either devoid of character or who entertains doubt as to the truth of what he professes to believe. I'm going to say something that's going to tick people off. The traditional orders like the fraternity, etc., can't speak out publicly as part of their basically agreement. That is not acceptable. It is the duty of all Christians, including priests, more so than laymen, that they must not remain silent when there are errors spreading against truth from anywhere. I know that many fraternity priests will preach against the errors in the church in sermons, but the order as such must affirm the conciliar revolution as such on paper. And that is a big problem. This is why the Ecclesia Dei communities cannot be a solution to the problem, even if, and I would never doubt this for a second, they represent a solution for individual souls. And God be praised for that. But there needs to be more. We need to have priests and bishops, because as laymen, we can't do it. And they have to be priests and bishops. It can't just only be Bishop Schneider. It can't only be Bishop Strickland. By the way, just as an aside, I haven't seen if Bishop Strickland or Schneider said anything, but Schneider and Strickland very manifestly proposed their support for the consecrations and for their belief that they would not be schismatic. So they, according to Cardinal Fernandez, may be excommunicated. Who knows? No one knows, because none of it makes sense. Humanae Generis from 1950. The duty incumbent on and that's from Pius XII, the duty incumbent on the faithful to flee also those errors which more or less approach heresy is sometimes as little known as if they did not exist. So he assumes that he takes it as a given that it is your duty to flee heresy or even errors which approach it. So you might say, well, fiducia supplicans may not technically be heretical. I think it is, but approaches heresy. You have to flee the teachings of the head of the DDF right now, according to Pius XII. This is a perennial teaching of the church, a perennial understanding of the duties of Christians. Leo XIII and Satis Cognitum. Oh, I should also say, when it comes to heresy, no. We can't make declarations that bind anyone on who is a formal heretic. But it is assumed that you can recognize heresy. And St. Paul talks about this, if an angel proposes to you a different gospel, don't believe it, that sort of thing. Even if it's an angel. And he's using, even if it's an angel, to say like the highest spiritual being. And an angel is higher than a person. So if we can recognize that in an angel, we can recognize that in a person. That's the logic of it. We can recognize heresy. A child who's been catechized for his first communion can recognize a heresy against the Holy Eucharist from the pulpit. He doesn't need a letter from Rome to confirm what is obvious. This is legalism. I can't go around, this is why I don't support sedevacantism, but I can't go around declaring who's a heretic and who's not. But I can say those statements are heretical. Because they are. Because I can walk and chew gum and I can read. He says in Leo XIII in 1896 in Satis Cognitum, he says, there is nothing more dangerous than those heretics who admit nearly the whole series of doctrines, and yet by one word, as with a drop of poison, taint the real and simple faith. Nothing more dangerous. Is that going on in the church? Have we not become accustomed to documents from the DDF, etc., where some of it's true, but then there's this little drop of poison in there? Come on. So right now, we're essentially facing a double necessity. So individuals must flee from heresy and heretics, regardless of formal condemnation. It's our duty to do so, according to the popes. And the second aspect is that those with authority have a positive duty to fight heresy with the fullness of their power. Lay people can't do it. Bishops have to do it. So the question that this hinges on here is, what happens with those with power to rule are negligent? The answer, for an individual, it's your duty to safeguard the faith so that it doesn't disappear. However, laymen need priests and bishops for the sacraments, and not just the sacraments, for the confirmation of the faith. When Christ said to Peter, "Feed my lambs," what does that mean? Confirm them in the faith. What happens if Peter's not feeding you? It's not just the sacraments. You can attend Mass every Sunday for the rest of your life. That's valid. But if you don't have the faith, you won't save your soul. The sacraments, like the Holy Eucharist, they afford you sanctifying grace in a sense, let's think sort of mathematically, proportional to the devotion you approach them with. This is why you have to be properly disposed for receiving Holy Communion. This is why you can receive Holy Communion more worthily, even more than a state of grace. Being in a state of grace to receive Holy Communion is a doctrinal minimum. But you read the literature of the great saints about receiving communion through Mary, for example, or in union with the Virgin Mary. It's like the deeper devotion. So you have to be fed spiritually, or you won't go to heaven. And it's the duty of the pastors of the church to do so, and laymen like myself can't do it. You don't have to listen to me. Laymen can't do it. It has to be bishops and priests. It has to be. And if they're not doing it, it doesn't have to afflict everybody, it just has to be several. Then we have a state of grave, general, public necessity, according to the tradition of the church. We need men of the cloth to confirm us in the faith, or we will die a spiritual death. The logic of this is that because of the grave and general public necessity that affects several souls, if not most, to be honest, but several at least, we have a state of necessity, and in a state of necessity, extraordinary actions are validated. This is reflected in the current Code of Canon Law, 1323 and 24, if you'd like to read it. And we also have theological tradition, and I'll read from a couple here. These are scholastics and Dominicans. Jesuit and Dominicans. We have Francisco Suarez, who after Thomas Aquinas is heralded by many as the greatest scholastic, or Thomas, whatever the term would be. Anyway, I'm tired. Suarez said, if the Pope lays down an order contrary to right customs, and one does not have to, if the Pope lays down an order contrary to right customs, one does not have to obey him. Now, customs is a term that can be interchangeable with law because custom has the force of law according to the scholastic tradition. The current way of consecrating bishops is a law, not a dogma, because it's not necessary or intrinsic to have the papal mandate to consecrate bishops. It's the law exclusively since 1917, and the practice has been back and forth, east and west, depending, for the last 1,000 years, and before that it was not the norm, generally speaking. He continues, he says, if he tries to do something manifestly opposed to justice and to the common good, like threatening to excommunicate faithful who don't know whether or not they're in schism or they're not at the same time, it would be licit to resist him. If he attacks by force, he could be repelled by force, and with the moderation characteristic of good defense. So he's talking about force equivocally here, not like taking up arms, but spiritual harm. I should add, it could be physical or spiritual. Because again, if something applies to the corporeal, the principles are higher in the metaphysical. It's a long podcast, but thank you for sticking around. Sylvester Prierias, he was a Dominican. He was a master of the Sacred Palace under Leo XIII, and he fought hard against Luther. And so take that into context, because everyone says, oh, you're a Protestant because you disobeyed the Pope. Well, here's a man who fought Protestantism and fought the Lutheran heresy, and was a go-to guy for the Pope at the time of Luther. Leo X excommunicated Luther, right? I think so. If the Pope destroys, this is Sylvester Prierias, if the Pope destroys the church by his orders and acts, he can be resisted and the execution of his mandate prevented. Speaking of mandates, anyone has the right to resist an unjust act, to try to prevent it, and to defend himself. So a man who fought the Lutherans and who was under the Pope who excommunicated Luther does not believe that resisting the Pope when he orders some things that harm the faithful makes you a Protestant. So stop calling people Protestants. You sound like an idiot. Now, this is not claiming that we have the authority to judge the Pope's office, only the natural law right to defend oneself and others from harm. And that Cajetan clarifies that. Now, self-defense works in two ways. Self-defense does not only mean that you keep a gun by your bed, and in the middle of the night, if somebody attacks you, you can protect yourself. That's one element of self-defense. You can also preemptively prepare yourself for the need to defend yourself if prudence demands it. When you read the Gospels, our Lord says, for example, what man would seek to build a tower without first counting the cost? What he's talking about is our necessity to prudentially assess a situation that will come to pass and then enact the necessary structures to protect ourselves from the offense. And our Lord also says, fear not him who can kill the body, but fear him who can kill the soul and cast it into hell. Attacks on the body are less important than attacks on the soul. If we exist in a state of grave and public general necessity, which we do, then actions must take place by prudential men, and they must be bishops and priests, to protect the faithful from the onslaught of heresy. Even if you believe that the Fraternity of St. Peter and the Ecclesia Dei Institutes do a good job, fine. But there are still several, if not millions of souls who don't have access to them, so it doesn't apply, and it doesn't solve the problem in the slightest. And those institutes themselves, the priests are basically tongue-tied, and they cannot, as orders as such, speak the truth against the errors that attack the church, which the popes and the moral theologians and the natural law theorists and anyone with this common sense before 50 years ago, 60 years ago, would tell us that they're not only encouraged to do, but required to do because their duty of state necessitates it. So they can't even do what their duty would require them to do in this circumstance when it is required of them. We need priests and bishops who can do that. I'm going to read you something on prudence here. So many have said that they don't believe that the consecrations were prudent. I disagree because of the wisdom of the spiritual masters, which I'll read to you here. This is from The Divine Intimacy, classic spiritual text. You buy this at a fraternity parish, get it at an SSPX bookstore. It's a good old-fashioned Catholic reading. That coffee was actually boiling hot. I'm just kidding. It was cold because it's been sitting there for an hour and a half. Prudent judgment. Entry number 274 from The Divine Intimacy. I'm reading this because this represents the mind of the church, because this book is perennially seen as something that represents that. So there you go. Not my words. Kennedy's an idiot. This guy's smart. The first duty of prudence is to help us choose the best means for attaining our final end. Many times the choice is easy and presents itself spontaneously to a mind accustomed to making judgments and acting in the light of eternity. So easy decisions between right and wrong. At other times, however, it is difficult and perplexing, as for example, when it concerns choosing one's vocation or profession, or solving complicated problems in which elements independent of one's own will must be considered. So many moving parts. In these cases, we must take time to examine everything carefully and to consult prudent, experienced persons. To act hastily would be to show want of prudence. It's funny, many of the faithful in the SSPX were annoyed that the SSPX was taking so long. It took Archbishop Lefebvre 18 years to make a decision. It took the SSPX, since Archbishop Lefebvre, 38 years. So I think they're taking their time. In the gospel, Jesus himself tells us about the prudent man who, having a mind to build a tower, first sits down and reckons the charges that are necessary, whether he have wherewithal to finish it. I mentioned that earlier. The time spent in these examinations and calculations as dictated by prudence is not time wasted. Quite the contrary. When facing serious decisions, we must realize that God himself often wants us to wait patiently until circumstances clearly manifest his will to us. Don Pagliarani took a long time. He was talking about this in 2021 at an Angelus conference about the process that would go forth with the consecration of bishops, and he said they'd follow the example of Archbishop Lefebvre and seek approval and all that kind of stuff. People have asked, well, why didn't they do it under Pope Francis? And Father Bruciani gave an answer in a recent podcast from the SSPX. The circumstances just didn't happen. So they were not thinking about consecrating bishops because at the time, up until a couple years ago, Bishop Wander had essentially joined the society and was starting to do certain sacramental functions for them. Bishop Tissier was still kicking, and then he died a very holy death. God bless him and God rest his soul and perhaps intercede for us, because you never know. And then the process started, and they did not do it quickly. But then Pope Francis died. And not only did Pope Francis die, in the lead up to his death, he was very unapproachable, which was months. So the necessity came that they needed bishops, because they were down to 2, and the faithful have more than doubled since 1988. So 2 bishops for about 1 million people. And they couldn't go through the process with Francis being sickly because he was not able to do such things. And it would be inappropriate to approach a sick man. It would be. It's not moral to do that. You can't be immoral in these considerations. And then Pope Leo was elected, and they sought for about a year to try to talk, or for 6 months or so, and he wouldn't respond. But the necessity didn't go away. And then Archbishop Lefebvre in 1986, he says that Assisi was basically one of the major things that pushed him towards it, because it was a clear attack on the kingship of Christ at the highest level of the church, which is an obvious sign. And then the document on the Virgin Mary was a big deal for Dom Pagliarani in the society, and I'm going to tell you why. It's one thing to go after the Son, who is the second person of the Holy Trinity. We know Christ can take his licks. He showed us that. It's quite another thing to go after his mother. And if you want to know why Dom Pagliarani was so incensed with righteous anger at how they treated the Blessed Mother with the downgrading of her perennial titles, it's because Dom Pagliarani è un figlio italiano e non esiste un figlio che ama sua madre più che un figlio italiano. No one loves his mother more than an Italian son. I don't care what my mother does. I will be there with that woman until the day she dies, holding her hand. You do not get between an Italian son and his mother. And the minute that you start going after her, kaput. All bets are off. Pope Francis even agreed with that. He said, when he was talking about, I think it was like terrorism or something, and he was kind of saying, well, you got to be careful the way, what do you expect these Muslims to do? Because you're going after, he said, it's like if you go after someone's mother and they punch you in the nose. It's kind of, Francis had some gems like that. Non si tocca la mamma. You don't touch the mother. You don't insult the mother. When you are insulting the mother of God, God help you. There can be no greater sign of irreverence and despicable diabolism than seeking to downgrade the veneration due to the mother, because there is no human creature that could ever exist who Christ loves more than his mother. So when you touch the mother, when you go after the mother, you offend Christ in a way that is incomprehensible. There's your sign for your prudence. Continues, it says, in this waiting, we should give a large place to prayer, begging our Lord for the light which our own prudence cannot give us. In fact, prudence, even though it is an infused supernatural virtue, is always a virtue exercised by human faculties and therefore is affected by human limitations. However, to help it, God has given us a special gift of the Holy Ghost, the gift of counsel, the actuation of which does not depend on us, but is obtainable by prayer. After using all these means suggested by supernatural prudence, we arrive at a decision. Prudence requires you to make a decision. Prudence then commands us to put into effect with courage and diligence, without needless delays on our part, and without being discouraged by the difficulties we may meet. Prudence demands that the courageous and heroic bishops of the church, of which there are very few, sadly, they must act on these things without delay and without waiting. It is not prudent to wait any longer, because they've waited long enough, they've prayed long enough, and the attacks on Christ and the Virgin Mary have been enough for long enough. And the faithful will die a spiritual death unless men of the cloth are there to confirm them in the faith. Valid sacraments is not enough. Continuing. So, what can we do once prudence tells us that extraordinary action is necessary in a state of necessity? There are 5 conditions. There must really be a state of necessity. Check. One must have attempted to remedy it by ordinary means first. Check. You don't have to endlessly, you have to just try. 3, the extraordinary act must not be intrinsically evil and do no harm to neighbor. Check. Consecrating bishops without a mandate is not intrinsically evil, and it is not schism, even though Cardinal Fernandez thinks it may or may not be at the same time and in the same place. The act must stay, 4, the act must stay within the limits actually required by the necessity. Exactly. So, they're not erecting dioceses, they're not erecting their own prelature or something, whatever. They are bishops and priests for the confirmation of the faith to the faithful who are starving. The necessity is as clear as day, my friends. And the validity, this is number 5, the validity of competent authority must never be questioned. You must presume it would consent in normal circumstances. So if these men who were in charge had the faith, they'd have no problem with it. So let's apply this to what happened in 88 and now. Necessity, yes. Ordinary means attempted, yes. Not intrinsically evil, yes. Consecration without mandate is not inherently sinful. We're going to talk about this in a sec. Stay within the limits, yes. No jurisdiction conferred, no parallel hierarchy, etc., etc. Validity of the authority questioned, not questioned, check. Listen to Father Polirani's sermon, listen to Archbishop Lefebvre. Now, one of the objections here is that consecrating bishops without a mandate is necessarily schismatic. We're going to talk about that. This argument largely comes from an interpretation of the Second Vatican Council promoted by the Fraternity of St. Peter, largely in their publication called Clave, which is their French publication. And there's a recent article that demonstrates this, and this is by a man with a pen name named Theologus. With respect, fraternity theologians, can you just put your name on it? Can you be man enough to just put your name on it? And it argues that consecration without mandate is impossible / schismatic because order and jurisdiction are conformed together. Now, this was answered by Father Glaze, who just summarizes the teaching of the Church. And it's in an article in the Courrier de Rome, and it's called De la nature de l'épiscopat. I think it's called Une réponse facile à la fraternité, or an easy answer for the fraternity, something like that. I have it in French, but you can download it, I think, from La Porte Latin, I think. And then you can, I have it, I don't know where I got it, but you can download it. And then you can put it through an AI translator, and they're pretty good. Honestly, Claude and stuff, they translate things really accurately. I can read French, Spanish, and Italian, and I do, but I often put it through translators to make sure, and then when I read it, I go, okay, it's accurate. Okay, so what's the move here? What happens is that there's this collapsing of the distinction between the power of order and the power of jurisdiction, so that any bishop without a canonical mission or mandate becomes a theological impossibility according to this mentality. The problem is this is not consistent with the prior teaching of the Church before the Council, and the Council defined nothing, by the way, and we'll go through what the Council teaches on it. Pius XII in Mystici Corporis, very authoritative and solemn document. We talked about the various documents. Talking about bishops, he says, in exercising this office, they are not altogether independent, but are subordinate to the lawful authority of the Roman pontiff, although enjoying the ordinary power of jurisdiction, which they receive directly from the supreme pontiff. So you receive jurisdiction from the Pope, not from the act of consecration. This is the preconciliar teaching. I don't know why supposedly traditional orders after the council are arguing for a theological novelty that is not found in the tradition. That is not tradition. Jurisdiction comes from the Pope, not automatically from the consecration itself. To this day, there are bishops consecrated for curial positions like diplomats and so forth. They're consecrated to titular dioceses. So it's not a real diocese, it's ceremonial. And they don't have jurisdiction. And that happens today. So this mentality does not even reflect the practice of the Church. Now, Vatican II complicates the matter. In Lumen Gentium 21, it seems to say that consecration confers teaching. I'll read it specifically for you here so you can understand it. Let me just find it here. Blah, 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 blah. Sorry. Okay. So Vatican II says the following in Lumen Gentium 21, paragraph 2. Episcopal consecration confers together with the office of sanctifying also the offices of teaching and of governing, which, however, of their very nature, can only be exercised in hierarchical communion with the head of the members of the college. If that were the plain reading of it, this would be contrary to the teaching of the Church in a way that is irreconcilable, and it would be an error in Vatican II. Now, that statement, I believe, is erroneous, but then there's a nota that was put at the end of the document to explain this, and this is in the nota in Lumen Gentium, which seeks to clarify. And it says, in this consecration, a person is given an ontological participation in the sacred function, munera. This is absolutely clear from tradition. Sacred functions, so power of orders. The word functions, munera, is used deliberately instead of the word powers, potestas, because the latter word could be understood as a power fully ready to act. But for this power to be fully ready to act, there must be a further canonical or juridical determination through the hierarchical authority. So you don't get the jurisdiction until it's conferred. This determination of power can consist in the granting of a particular office or in the allotment of subjects, and it is done according to the norms approved by the Supreme Pontiff. An additional norm of this sort is required by the very nature of the case because it involves functions, munera, which must be exercised by many subjects cooperating in the hierarchical manner in accordance with Christ's will, etc. In typical Vatican II fashion, this explanation is a bit unclear. It's clear enough in some ways, but it's a bit unclear, and it's left open to interpretation, which is the problem. But to be fair, we could interpret this from the vantage point of tradition, and we could summarize it like this. When a bishop is consecrated, he receives fully the power of orders, and he receives the power of jurisdiction in potency. You as a Catholic man are in potency the Pope. Because the Pope only necessarily only must be a Catholic man. He doesn't already have to be a bishop. Now, that's not going to happen. But you can accept the papacy if you are elected, and then after that, and once you accept it, you would have jurisdiction over the whole church, but then they would consecrate you as the Bishop of Rome. So the power must be activated, etc. The point is that it's not intrinsically given to you unless by the Pope. Obviously, well, every priest can perform a confirmation. In potency, every priest can perform a confirmation, but he must be given delegation by the bishop, or it must be done in a state of necessity. Like, for example, a priest can, our son was born and died, and I baptized him in the operating room, and our priest confirmed him because that's a custom of the church that a priest has the permission to do so for the sake of the soul in that necessity. He has the potency to do so, but only certain circumstances allow it, and normally speaking, it has to be the delegation of the bishop. So here's the thing. This opinion that it must be schismatic because of the power of jurisdiction is not consistent with a fair traditional reading of Vatican II. It also goes against the tradition received from Trent, from Leo XIII, from St. Thomas, and even the note from Vatican II, when they're read in their full context and in the light of tradition. You have to read them in the light of the novelty. For example, St. Thomas talks about when a bishop is deposed and then he's reimposed, I guess, he must not be reconsecrated for there to be jurisdiction. So when he's deposed, he doesn't have the power of jurisdiction. When he's reimposed, he gets it again. If it was intrinsic to the consecration of a bishop to always have jurisdiction because of the consecration, then when he was deposed, he would be a bishop without a diocese. With jurisdiction, he would be a schismatic. That doesn't make any sense. And this leads me to another point. I've seen it going around that the bishops of the SSPX are not auxiliaries, but they're what's called, let me get the term right here. The term is episcopus vagans, so basically vagabond bishops. So this is someone, historically, this is how it's understood. They're basically bishops not attached to anything. So historically, we see this with weird sects like the Palmarians, or we see this with bishops who have been deposed, and then they basically go and start their own little sect. That does not apply to the bishops of the SSPX. In reality, it's difficult to find a proper category for the bishops of the SSPX, but this category does not apply. Why? Because the characteristics of an episcopus vagans, a vagabond bishop or vagrant bishop, Let me find it here. The characteristics are, hold on. 1 second. So the characteristics of the episcopus vagans, it's when they have a flock that exists to serve the bishop himself. That's one of the main characteristics. Also, it is when they have no, at least attempt or connection to have any communion with the church at all. So like some independent sedevacantist bishop, etc. So not only is it, there are similarities between an episcopus vagans and a SSPX bishop, but there are similarities between a missionary bishop who has no diocese. Or there are similarities between an episcopus vagans and a deposed bishop, like Bishop Strickland. He's a deposed bishop. He has no job, so to speak. But you become an episcopus vagans, it's essentially like schism. It's essentially like schism. It's not the proper term. It is not the proper term. The reason why the SSPX uses the term auxiliary, I'll read it to you. The reason is because the terms used between Ratzinger and the SSPX in 1988 to refer to the in principle bishop or bishops that would be allowed as part of that protocol. And by the way, the protocol between Lefebvre and Ratzinger was basically like a document to outline the framework for discussion. It's not more than that. People inflate it too much, but it was said in there that let me read it. That for practical and psychological reasons, the consecration of a member of the society as a bishop appears useful, and there was no classification given. So what it was understood that they would function like auxiliaries. At the time, they did not have a structure, the way that they have proposed something like a prelature. So this is an example where categories kind of fail. So the reason why the term auxiliary is used is because the auxiliary bishop historically has been understood as one who merely performs sacramental functions to aid in the help of the church. So if you want to quibble about the use of auxiliary, fine. But what other word can you use? Because you can't use episcopus vagans because that's not what they are. They don't have that characteristic. And very specifically, an episcopus vagans is one who explicitly has no appearance of any communion with the church at all. So, okay, take yesterday out of the equation for a second. I mean, Bishop Fillet, was given the task of doing canonical procedures at times. That's an obvious interaction and communion with the church legally. So that term could not apply at all by any stretch of the imagination before yesterday. And even now, in order to be something, you have to be that thing, just not be called that thing. So it is not the will of the SSPX bishops to have no recognized juridical or whatever communion. An episcopus vagans is basically someone who says, to heck with the authorities, I'll do whatever the heck I want, and I won't even recognize them. This is like sedevacantist bishops. The SSPX bishops cannot be called this. It's a misapplication of terms, and it's wrong to use it. If you want to say, well, I don't think they're auxiliaries, fine. The categories fail. But you can't apply a wrong category when you don't know what category to use. That's just another type of error, and it needs to stop. It's just not correct, and using that is leading people astray. Episcopus vagans are like the Palmarian bishops, or like the CMRI Took line, or whatever the heck it is, where it's like it's literally just not attached to the church in any way at all. So we're going to finish up here because I'm getting tired. Okay. So How should I finish this? Again, I recommend reading the article that I'll post. It's more than what I'm saying now. Some people may argue that there are various reasons why there no longer is a state of necessity, so everything I've said can apply. One of the arguments is that there's more clergy or laity devoted to tradition now than there were in 1988. The problem is that's very speculative because we can't know what the 1988 clergy believed. Most of them had actually grown up with the old Mass and the old formation, and they were only 18 years removed from it. So for all we know, they were sad and they missed it, and they actually did have an interior devotion to it, but they just didn't have the freedom to do it. Another example is people will say, well, the fervor for Vatican II has subsided. This is untenable as an argument. Maybe it's subsided by certain lay people, but Pope Leo is the Pope, and he said they want a Vatican II harder. And the spirit of Vatican II has become the spirit of synodality, so it's even worse. Another one is the idea that more people attend the old Mass now, and then there are more Orthodox Catholics. Well, true, but this argues for bishops of the society, not against it, because there's about 1 million of those people attend society chapels and they need sacraments. And again, the grave general necessity does not require it to be universal, it only has to affect several. And the issue is not primarily liturgical, it has to be about the faith as such, not just access to the traditional Latin Mass. Because the problem is that the effect of the mentality of the Ecclesia Dei groups, I'm not attacking persons, I'm just talking about it in general principles, is that tradition is relegated to some sort of preference and not something that must be for the whole church. If tradition is true and the modernist revolution is wrong, then it cannot be the case that tradition must merely be tolerated. It must be instantiated as the universal norm, and the modernism must be seen as intolerable. It can't be the other way around. There's another idea that, papalatry is collapsing. Well, yeah, I've heard this. This isn't true at all. The vast majority of traditional Catholic commentators seem to have, in some ways, forgotten what they've been saying for the last decade and then come down to, well, Peter is Peter. Well, you might as well say love is love. So, we've gone over the state of necessity. We've gone over the arguments and the documents from Cardinal Fernandez. We've gone over everything he cited in detail. This is a very long show. In the end here, the Society offers a comprehensive resistance to the errors afflicting Catholics worldwide, and they're uniquely positioned to serve the faithful with tradition in its fullness, not just liturgically, and as such, not just as individuals. And their prelates uniquely preach, except for maybe a couple men, but uniquely preach with true parrhesia. Parrhesia is the virtue that is applied to the prophets. And it means speaking the truth freely, essentially, without worrying about consequences. Very few men do that today. Archbishop Lefebvre was a saint of parrhesia. The prophets will declare the truth, and prophecy doesn't mean only speaking like future predictions. It means speaking the truth that has remained hidden so that it can come to the light. So Daniel was a prophet, sure, when he speaks like the secret meaning of dreams, but Elijah and so forth, these are prophets who they just speak the truth. And they're always condemned for it. So we should expect the bishops and the priests of the SSPX to be condemned because they demonstrate the virtue of the prophets who were always condemned. And what did Christ say to the Pharisees? He said, "Woe to you who erect monuments of the prophets." He didn't mean that it was wrong to erect monuments, but he said, because you're hypocrites. He meant because you're hypocrites, because you erect the monuments of the very men who stand against what you're doing and you kill them for it. That's what's happening. This makes their actions not just permissible under the state of necessity, but heroic. That's all I got for you. I'm hungry. I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.